The morning Opal Quinn's wedding dress caught fire in the parlor stove was the same morning she decided she would never again let a man decide the shape of her life. It was the spring of 1878, in the dusty cattle town of Larkspur Flats, Wyoming Territory, and Opal stood in the doorway of the Kendrick ranch house watching the silk go up in orange flame, feeling something inside her chest unclench for the first time in months. Behind her, Silas Whitmore's mother was shrieking about ruined lace and wasted money, and somewhere out past the corral, Silas himself was shouting at the ranch hands as though a fire in the stove was the greatest catastrophe ever to befall Larkspur Flats. Opal had not lit the stove. She had not thrown the dress in either. It had simply happened, the way disasters happen to people who have stopped believing anything good will ever happen to them again. And as she watched the flames curl the hem of the gown she was meant to wear in 4 days' time, she felt only relief. 3 hours earlier, Silas Whitmore, the wealthiest cattle baron in 3 counties, had stood in his mother's parlor and told Opal, in front of his ranch foreman and 2 of his sisters, that he had reconsidered their engagement. "You understand, Miss Quinn," he had said, not quite meeting her eyes. "A man in my position needs a wife who brings something to the union. Land, cattle, connections. Your father's debts are well known in this territory, and I cannot have people whispering that Silas Whitmore married a pauper's daughter out of pity." Opal had stood very still, her hands folded in front of her traveling dress, and had said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a man who had courted her for 8 months, who had written her letters full of promises, who had asked her father for her hand, and then, upon her father's sudden death and the revelation of his considerable debts, had simply decided the arithmetic no longer favored him. She was 22 years old, and she had crossed 200 miles of prairie by wagon and rail to marry a man who did not want her the moment she was no longer profitable. "I see," she had said finally, and had walked out of the parlor with her spine straight as a fence post, and had gone to sit by the stove because it was the only warm place in that cold house. And that was when someone, she never learned who, had knocked the half-finished wedding gown from its hook, and it had drifted down onto the stove's hot iron top like a dying swan. Now she stood in the yard with her single trunk beside her, 22 years old and utterly alone in a territory where she knew not one soul who owed her kindness, and she watched Silas Whitmore's mother wring her hands over burnt silk instead of a broken heart, and Opal Quinn began, quietly, to laugh. It was not joyful laughter. It was the laughter of a woman standing at the very bottom of a well, looking up at a small circle of sky, and understanding that the only way left to go was up. Miss Quinn, the foreman, a heavy-set man named Purdy, approached her with obvious discomfort, twisting his hat in his hands. "Mr. Whitmore says you're welcome to stay through the week until you've made arrangements. He didn't mean no unkindness by it, it's just business." "Of course," Opal said, "business." She did not stay through the week. She stayed one more night, in the small guest room at the edge of the house, and in the morning she took what money remained to her, $41 sewn into the lining of her second-best dress, and she walked into Larkspur Flats to find out what a woman with no family, no husband, and no prospects might do to keep herself alive. The answer, as it turned out, smelled like lanolin and dust, and it came in the form of an old Basque sheepherder named Etienne Laraga, who was dying, slowly and without complaint, in a room above the mercantile. Opal had gone to the mercantile to sell her mother's silver hairbrush, the last fine thing she owned, when she heard the shopkeeper's wife talking about the old sheepman upstairs who could not find anyone to take his flock. Cattlemen in Larkspur Flats hated sheep with a passion bordering on religious conviction, believing, as most cattlemen of that era did, that sheep cropped the grass too close to the roots and ruined range for cattle forever after. No cowboy in the county would touch a flock of sheep for any wage, and the old man's herd, some 300 head grazing on leased land at the edge of the Wind River foothills, was as good as abandoned. He's asking for anyone, to take them off his hands before he passes, the shopkeeper's wife said, shaking her head. Says he'll sign over the lease and what's left of his savings to whoever will see the flock through the winter, but who'd want 300 sheep in cattle country. Man be run out on a rail. Opal Quinn, who had nothing left to lose and a keen, cold understanding that the men of Larkspur Flats had already decided her worth and found it wanting, walked up the narrow stairs above the mercantile and knocked on old Etienne's door. He was a small man, shrunken by illness, with white whiskers and pale blue eyes that studied her with surprising sharpness. "You're the girl Whitmore threw over," he said, not unkindly, in an accent that rounded his vowels strangely. "Word travels fast in a small town." "I am," Opal said, refusing to flinch, "and I understand you have sheep nobody wants." "Nobody wants them because nobody understands them," Etienne said. "A sheep is not a stupid animal, whatever the cattlemen say. A sheep is a creature that trusts you completely, the way a child trusts you, and if you betray that trust, it will die of a broken heart before it dies of anything else. Cattle you can drive with fear. Sheep you must lead with love." He studied her for a long moment. "Do you know anything of animals, Miss Quinn?" "I know that every animal I have ever cared for has loved me back honestly," she said, "which is more than I can say for men." Etienne Laraga laughed, a wheezing, delighted sound, and then began to cough so hard Opal had to fetch him water. When he had recovered, he looked at her with those pale eyes and said, "Then perhaps you and my sheep will suit each other very well. I have no children, no family left in this territory. My partner Diego went back to the old country 2 years past. I am dying, Miss Quinn, and I would rather my flock go to a woman with nothing to lose than rot on land no cattleman will touch out of spite. Can you write your name?" "I can." "Then we will go before the land agent this afternoon if you are willing, and I will sign the lease over to you, along with what money I have left, which is not much, but it will buy you supplies and a wagon. In exchange, you will see that my dog Bandit is fed, and that the flock does not scatter to the wolves before you learn their ways." Opal Quinn, 4 days after being rejected by the richest man in the county, became the owner of 300 sheep, a leaky wagon, a one-eyed sheepdog named Bandit, and $11 in cash, and she felt richer than she had ever felt in her life. Etienne Laraga died 11 days later, peacefully in his sleep, and Opal buried him herself on a small rise above the leased grazing land, because no one else in Larkspur Flats would spare a wagon or a shovel for a sheepman's funeral. She said what words she could remember from her mother's old prayer book, and Bandit sat beside the grave and howled once, low and mournful, and then never mentioned it again in the way that dogs do not. And Opal Quinn was alone with 300 sheep at the edge of the Wind River foothills, 22 years old, and entirely unafraid, because there was nothing left in her that fear could reach. The first winter nearly killed her. She had not understood, when she took on the flock, how much a person could not know about sheep and still be expected to keep them alive. She learned by mistake and by candlelight, reading the few tattered notes Etienne had left behind, written in a mixture of English and Basque that she had to puzzle out letter by letter. She learned that ewes needed extra feed before lambing, that a sheep with foot rot would go lame within days if not treated, that wolves and coyotes tested a flock at the edges every single night looking for weakness, and that Bandit, for all his missing eye, could smell a predator on the wind before she ever heard a sound. She learned to shear, clumsily at first, nicking more than one ewe and crying over the blood until she forced herself to grow steadier hands. She learned to deliver a breech lamb by candlelight in a snowstorm, her arms disappearing to the elbow inside a laboring ewe while Bandit stood guard at the shelter's opening. She learned to go 3 days without proper sleep during lambing season and still rise before dawn to check the flock. And she learned, most of all, that the town of Larkspur Flats had decided what she was, a sheep woman, a fallen bride, a curiosity to be pitied or scorned, and she found she did not particularly care what they thought, because, for the first time since her father's death, she was building something with her own two hands that no man could take from her by simply changing his mind. It was in her second spring on the leased land, in April of 1879, that she first laid eyes on Albert Kendrick. She was mending a break in the drift fence at the northern edge of her grazing land when she heard a horse approaching, and she straightened with her hammer still in hand, wary, because a lone rider on sheep land usually meant trouble from one of the cattle outfits that resented her presence on grass they considered rightfully theirs. The rider who came into view was younger than she expected, perhaps 26 or 27, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who worked cattle for a living, with sun-browned skin and dark hair curling out from under a battered hat. He rode a rangy bay gelding and led a second horse behind him, and as he drew nearer she saw that his left arm was bound in a crude sling made from what looked like a torn shirt. "Ma'am," he said, drawing rein a respectful distance away, "I don't mean to trouble you, but I've come off my horse hard about 2 miles back, and I believe I've broke something in this arm. I saw your smoke and hoped you might spare some water and maybe point me toward a doctor." Opal studied him for a long moment, hammer still in hand. Cattlemen did not, as a rule, ask sheep women for help. Cattlemen, as a rule, rode wide around sheep land as though it carried plague. "Nearest doctor's in Larkspur Flats, a good 3 hours' ride," she said. "You won't make it with that arm jostling the whole way without setting it first. Come down off your horse and let me look." He hesitated, and she saw the flicker of the same prejudice she had come to expect from every man in the territory, the quick mental calculation of *sheep woman* against need. And then, to her surprise, he swung down from the saddle, wincing as his boots hit the ground. "I'm obliged," he said. "Name's Albert Kendrick. I ride for the Bar Diamond outfit over west of here." "Opal Quinn," she said, and watched his face for the reaction that name always seemed to provoke among cattle folk, the flicker of recognition, the pity or the scorn. But Albert Kendrick's expression didn't change at all, and she realized with something like surprise that he simply did not know who she was. "You're hurt," she said instead. "Sit down there on that rock and let me see." She had set enough bones on sheep, and once on herself when she'd fallen from a wagon her first winter, to know roughly how it was done. Albert Kendrick's forearm was swollen and already bruising dark, and when she probed it gently he sucked in his breath through his teeth but did not cry out or curse at her the way she half expected a cowboy to do. "It's broken clean, I think, not shattered," she said. "I can splint it well enough to get you to town without doing more harm if you can bear the setting." "I've borne worse," he said, and there was a dry humor in his voice that surprised her again. "Go on, then." She fashioned a splint from 2 flat pieces of fence rail and strips torn from an old feed sack, and when she set the bone straight, Albert Kendrick made a low sound in his throat and went pale beneath his sunburn, but he did not pull away, and when it was done he looked at her with something like wonder. "You've done that before," he said. "On sheep mostly. Bones are bones." "I reckon they are." He flexed his fingers experimentally, wincing. "You have my thanks, Miss Quinn. I don't know many folks who'd stop what they were doing to help a stranger, especially a cattle hand strayed onto sheep ground. Most in this territory would as soon shoot a man for less." "Most in this territory have decided a great many things about me already," Opal said, more sharply than she intended, "so I've stopped much caring what most in this territory think." Something in his face shifted then, a kind of careful curiosity. "You're the woman who took on Laraga's flock. I heard talk of it at the Larkspur Mercantile, though nobody could tell me much beyond that a woman had done what no cowboy in the county would." "That's me," Opal said, waiting for whatever unkindness would follow, the same as it always did from cattlemen. Instead, Albert Kendrick looked out over the grazing hillside, where her flock moved like a slow, gray-white river across the new grass, bandit trotting along the edges keeping them bunched, and he said, quietly, "Takes more grit than most men have, to build something out of what everybody else calls worthless." Opal Quinn, who had not been complimented by a man in nearly 2 years, felt something warm and unfamiliar move through her chest, and she did not entirely know what to do with it, so she busied herself checking the splint again and said nothing at all. She gave him water from her canteen and a portion of the hard biscuit she carried for her midday meal, and she walked with him, leading his horses, the mile back to where the ground grew rocky enough that he could remount without too much pain, and before he rode on toward town she said, "You'll want that arm looked at properly by the doctor and kept still for 6 weeks at the least." "I'll do that," Albert said, and then, after a pause, "Would you mind terribly if I rode back this way, once it's healed, to properly thank you? Seems an inadequate goodbye for a woman who just saved me a long, agonizing ride." Opal considered him for a long moment, this cattleman with kind eyes and no apparent scorn for sheep women, and something in her, some small stubborn hope she thought had died in Silas Whitmore's parlor, stirred faintly back to life. "I wouldn't mind," she said. He smiled then, wide and unguarded, and rode off toward Larkspur Flats with his broken arm held carefully against his chest, and Opal Quinn stood watching him go for far longer than was sensible, before Bandit's insistent barking reminded her that 300 sheep did not tend to themselves. Albert Kendrick did not come back in 6 weeks. He came back in 9 days, his arm still splinted but the swelling much reduced, riding up to her small cabin at dusk with a jackrabbit he'd shot slung over his saddle as an offering. "Doctor says I'm not fit for ranch work for another month at least," he said, by way of explanation for his presence, "and a man goes half-mad sitting idle at the bunkhouse. Thought I might make myself useful to somebody who'd have use for an idle man, one-armed as I am." Opal, who had been mending a torn shirt by lantern light and had not expected company, felt a foolish flutter of pleasure that she immediately tried to suppress. "I don't know that a man with a broken arm is much use around sheep," she said, though she was already stepping aside to let him tie his horse. "I can hold a lantern. I can talk to keep a body company. I can eat my share of that jackrabbit if you'll roast it," he said, and there was something so easy and warm in his manner that Opal found herself laughing, really laughing, for what felt like the first time in over a year. They roasted the jackrabbit over her fire that evening, and Albert told her about growing up the son of a failed homesteader in Nebraska, about coming west at 17 to work cattle, because it was the only honest work a boy with no land and no money could find, about the years of hard riding and low wages that had taught him everything he knew of patience and grit. He asked about her father, and she found herself telling him, haltingly at first and then with more ease, about the debts, about Silas Whitmore, about the burning wedding dress and the strange, terrible relief she had felt watching it go up in flames. "He was a fool," Albert said simply, when she had finished, no pity in his voice, only a plain, flat certainty. "Any man who'd throw over a woman like you for the sake of arithmetic doesn't deserve to be called a man at all." "You don't know me well enough to say that," Opal said, though her voice had gone unsteady. "I know you set a stranger's bone without a second thought, and built a life out of 300 sheep everybody else called worthless, and you're sitting here roasting jackrabbit with a one-armed cowboy instead of turning him away," Albert said. "I know enough." They sat late into the night by her small fire, talking of small things and large ones, and Bandit lay between them with his head on his paws, and when Albert finally rose to ride back to the Bar Diamond bunkhouse, he paused at his horse and said, "Would you mind if I came again, Miss Quinn? Not out of obligation this time, just because I find I like the company." "I wouldn't mind," Opal said again, and this time there was no hesitation in it at all. He came again 3 days later, and then 3 days after that, and by midsummer Albert Kendrick, his arm healed and strong again, had taken to riding out to Opal's grazing land nearly every evening after his work at the Bar Diamond was done, and the ranch hands there had begun to talk, in the way that ranch hands always talked, about Kendrick's suite on the sheep woman. It was not only talk of affection, though. As the season wore on, Opal noticed a change in the way certain men of Larkspur Flats looked at her flock when she came to town for supplies. The Bar Diamond's owner, a hard, ambitious man named Reginald Cobb, had been buying up grazing leases across the territory, and word around town was that he intended to run the largest cattle operation in the region within 5 years, and that any small operator, sheep or cattle, who stood in his way would find their leases contested or their water rights challenged in ways that always seemed to favor Cobb in the end. Opal's lease, still held in her name from the day old Etienne had signed it over, covered good grazing ground along a seasonal creek that Cobb's foreman had been eyeing for cattle expansion for over a year. She had heard the rumors before, vague threats about sheep ruining the range for cattle forever after, about how sheep folk in other territories had been run off by night riders or had their flocks scattered and slaughtered, and she had tried not to let the fear settle too deep in her. But as autumn approached and Albert's visits grew more frequent and more tender, so too did the tension between the cattle outfits and the woman with 300 sheep on land they wanted. "Cobb's been talking in town," Albert told her one evening in September, his voice troubled as they sat together outside her cabin, watching the sun sink behind the foothills in a wash of orange and violet. "Says sheep have no business on that creek ground, says he means to see the lease revoked one way or another. I don't like the sound of it, Opal. Cobb's not a man who loses gracefully, and he's not always particular about how he wins." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal miss before it, and she noticed, and something in her chest tightened pleasantly even as her stomach knotted with worry over his words. "The lease is legal," she said. "Etienne signed it over proper, before witnesses, filed with the land office in Cheyenne. There's nothing Cobb can do about that through lawful means." "I didn't say lawful means," Albert said quietly, and the worry in his voice deepened her own. He was, she had come to understand over the months of his courtship, a man of unusual conscience for a cattle hand in that territory. He had grown up hard and poor, had seen firsthand what it meant to have nothing and to be looked down upon for it, and something in him had never been able to fully embrace the casual cruelty with which most cattlemen treated sheep folk, immigrants, and anyone else deemed beneath their notice. He had told her one evening about an incident 3 years past when he had witnessed a group of cowboys from another outfit stampede a Mexican sheepherder's flock off a cliff edge for sport, and how sick it had made him, and how he had quit that outfit within the month rather than ride with men capable of such cruelty. "I won't let Cobb do anything to your flock," Albert said now, his jaw set. "Not while I've got breath in me." "You work for him," Opal reminded him gently. "The Bar Diamond is Cobb's outfit. If it comes to a choice between his cattle interests and me, you'd be putting your own livelihood at risk." "Then I'll put it at risk," Albert said, and the fierce certainty in his voice left no room for argument. "Opal, I've been riding out here near every evening for 4 months now, and I think you know as well as I do what that means. I'm not a man of many words when it comes to matters of the heart, never have been, but I love you, plain and simple, and I won't stand by while a man like Cobb tries to take away everything you've built with your own 2 hands. Sheep, cattle, none of that signifies to me. What signifies is you." Opal Quinn, who had spent 2 years believing herself unworthy of any man's genuine devotion, sat very still in the dying light of that September evening and felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes. "I love you too, Albert Kendrick," she said, her voice breaking on his name. "I have for some months now, though I didn't dare say it, for fear that saying it would somehow break the spell and you'd realize what a poor bargain I am, sheep and debts and a burnt wedding dress behind me." "There's no poor bargain in you," Albert said, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "There's the finest woman I've ever known, and I mean to marry you, Opal, if you'll have me, once this business with Cobb is settled and I can offer you something more than a cowboy's wages and a borrowed horse." "I don't need more than that," Opal whispered. "I need you." He kissed her then, gently at first and then with a fervor that left them both breathless. There in the fading light with the sheep grazing peacefully around them, and Bandit watching with his one good eye from a respectful distance. And Opal Quinn felt, for the first time since her father's death, entirely and completely safe. But the trouble with Cobb did not wait politely for their happiness to settle. Within a fortnight, Opal woke one morning to find nearly 40 of her ewes missing from the flock, the fence along the creek cut clean through with wire cutters, and hoofprints leading off toward Bar Diamond Range. She rode into town that same day, furious and frightened in equal measure, and found the land agent, a nervous, sweating man named Higgins who would not quite meet her eyes. "Now, Miss Quinn," he said, shuffling papers on his desk, "there's been some question raised about the boundaries of your lease. Mr. Cobb's surveyor claims the creek fence was built in error, encroaching on Bar Diamond Range by some 100 yards. It's possible your flock strayed onto land they had no legal right to graze, in which case, well, a man's got every right to move stray stock off his own property. 40 ewes don't stray through a cut fence on their own, Mr. Higgins," Opal said, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "That fence was cut with tools, not broken by animals. This is theft, plain and simple, and I mean to see justice done." "Justice is a fine word, Miss Quinn," Higgins said, still not meeting her eyes. "But justice in this territory tends to favor the man with the most cattle and the most influence, and I'd advise you not to make an enemy of Reginald Cobb over 40 sheep." Opal left the land office with her hands clenched into fists, and her heart pounding with a fury she had not felt since Silas Whitmore's parlor, and she rode straight to the Bar Diamond Ranch house, ignoring every instinct that told her a lone woman confronting a powerful cattle baron on his own ground was a foolish and dangerous thing to do. Reginald Cobb received her on his front porch with an expression of amused condescension that reminded her painfully of Silas. "Miss Quinn," he said, not rising from his chair, "I hear you've had some trouble with your fence line. You know exactly what trouble I've had, Mr. Cobb, because your men caused it," Opal said, standing tall despite the tremor in her voice. "I want my ewes returned, and I want that fence repaired, and I want your men to stay off my leased ground from this day forward." Cobb studied her for a long moment, and then he smiled, a thin, cold expression that made her skin crawl. "Your leased ground, Miss Quinn, sits on some of the finest grazing in this territory, grass that's been ruined for cattle the moment your sheep crop it down to the roots. I've offered fair money for that lease 3 times now, through the land office, and 3 times you've refused to sell. I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits, and so does my tolerance for sheep on land that ought to be running cattle. The lease is mine, legally and rightfully, signed over by Etienne Laraga before witnesses," Opal said. "You have no claim to it and no right to steal my stock to force my hand." "Prove it was theft," Cobb said, still smiling that cold smile. "Prove my men cut your fence, prove those ewes didn't simply wander onto Bar Diamond Range of their own accord. You'll find, Miss Quinn, that in this county, proof tends to favor whoever holds the most sway with the sheriff and the judge, and I hold considerable sway indeed." Opal rode away from the Bar Diamond Ranch house with rage and helplessness warring in her chest, and it was only when she reached the halfway point back to her own land that she found Albert waiting for her on the trail, having heard from another hand what she'd done and fearing for her safety. "Opal, are you hurt? What happened?" He was off his horse, and at her side before she'd fully reined in, his hands checking her over for injury, with an urgency that would have been comical under different circumstances. "I'm not hurt, only angrier than I've ever been in my life," she said, and told him everything: Cobb's cold smile, Higgins's cowardice, the casual theft of her ewes dressed up as a boundary dispute. Albert's jaw tightened as he listened, and when she'd finished he was quiet for a long moment, staring off toward the Bar Diamond Range with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something hard and calculating that spoke of a man who had finally reached the limit of what he could stomach. "I know where he'd have those ewes penned, if they're still on Bar Diamond ground," he said finally. "There's a holding pasture near the North Line shack out of the way, where strays get sorted before they're driven back or, in this case, likely held until you're forced to sell out of desperation. I could get them back for you tonight, before Cobb has time to drive them further or sell them off quiet. Albert, that's theft, the same as what he did to me. If you're caught, you'll lose your position, maybe worse. Cobb's not a man who'd hesitate to have you arrested or hurt for taking back what's rightfully mine. Then I won't get caught, Albert said, with a steadiness that both frightened and steadied her in turn. Opal, I told you I wouldn't stand by while Cobb tried to take what you've built. I meant it, trust me. She did trust him, completely and without reservation, and that trust was rewarded that very night when Albert rode back to her cabin just before dawn, 40 ewes bleeding and stumbling ahead of him, and 2 other riders she recognized as fellow Bar Diamond hands, men named Whitfield and Occam, who had apparently shared Albert's discomfort with Cobb's methods and had agreed to help under cover of darkness. We cut the pasture fence and drove them back along the creek bed, out of sight of the North Line shack, Albert said, exhaustion and triumph mingling in his voice as he helped her check the ewes for injury. Cobb won't know they're missing until his men do a count come morning, and by then there'll be no tracks worth following, not with the rain that's coming. Albert, I don't know how to thank you, Opal said, tears standing in her eyes as she embraced him there in the gray light before dawn, uncaring that Whitfield and Occam stood watching with knowing grins. You don't need to thank me, Albert murmured into her hair. Just promise me you'll be careful, Opal. Cobb's not going to let this go easy, not the theft nor the courtship. Man like that, when he loses even a small victory, he tends to come back twice as hard. Albert's warning proved prescient within the week. Word came to the Bar Diamond bunkhouse that Cobb had discovered not only the return of the missing ewes, but also, through loose talk among the hands, exactly who had orchestrated it. And Albert Kendrick found himself summoned to Cobb's office and dismissed from the Bar Diamond's employ on the spot, with a warning that he'd best not show his face on Cobb's range again if he valued his safety. Opal felt sick with guilt when Albert told her, riding out to her cabin that same evening with his few belongings tied behind his saddle, having nowhere else to go. "This is my fault," she said, wringing her hands as he unloaded his gear near her small barn. "You've lost your position, your income, everything, because you helped me." "I've lost a job working for a man who steals from widows and sheep women and calls it business," Albert said, setting down his saddlebags with more calm than she felt he had any right to. "Opal, I've been saving what wages I could these past years, not much, but enough to make a small start somewhere. I've been thinking, even before this happened, about whether I wanted to spend my whole life riding for another man's brand, taking his orders, watching him grow rich off my labor while I stayed poor. Cobb's dismissal just hurried along a decision I believe I'd already made in my heart." "What decision is that?" Opal asked, though something in his tone had already told her the answer. "To build something of my own," Albert said, turning to face her fully, his expression earnest in the fading light. "With you, Opal, if you'll still have me. I've got maybe $300 saved, enough to buy a small herd of my own, cattle or sheep, whichever we choose together, and enough to file on a homestead claim if we married and worked the land as partners. I know it's not the grand life a cattle baron could offer you, nothing like what Silas Whitmore promised and then took away. But it would be honest, and it would be ours, built together from nothing the same way you built your flock from nothing." Opal Quinn stood in the gathering dusk, looking at this man who had given up his livelihood rather than stand by while injustice was done to a woman he loved, and she felt the last of her old fear, the fear that had haunted her since Silas Whitmore's parlor, finally and completely dissolve. "Yes," she said, before he had even fully finished asking. "Yes, Albert Kendrick, I'll marry you, and I'll build whatever life we can build together, sheep or cattle or both. And I won't ever again let any man tell me what I'm worth, because you've already shown me I'm worth everything to you, exactly as I am." They were married 3 weeks later, in November of 1879, in a small ceremony at the Larkspur Flats Methodist Church, attended by a handful of townsfolk who had come to respect the sheep woman's grit over her 2 years in the territory, by Whitfield and Occam, who had stood by Albert despite the risk to their own positions, and by Old Bandit, who sat solemnly at the church door throughout the ceremony as though he understood the significance of the occasion. Opal wore a simple blue dress, not silk, not fine, purchased with her own hard-earned money from the mercantile, and she thought, as she stood at the altar beside Albert Kendrick, of the wedding dress that had burned in Silas Whitmore's stove, and felt only gratitude that fate had spared her from a marriage built on arithmetic rather than love. The reverend who married them, an elderly man named Fitch who had seen enough of the territory's hardships to have little patience left for cattle and sheep politics, spoke simply of love as a covenant built through shared labor and shared hardship rather than wealth or status, and Opal found herself crying, not from sorrow but from a happiness so complete it nearly overwhelmed her. "Do you, Albert Kendrick, take this woman, Opal Quinn, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Albert said, his voice steady and sure, "and I promise before God and these witnesses that I will stand beside her against any injustice this territory sees fit to throw our way, for as long as I draw breath." "Do you, Opal Quinn, take this man, Albert Kendrick, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Opal said, her voice breaking with emotion, "and I promise that I will never again let fear or shame keep me from building the life I want, with the man I love beside me." They were pronounced husband and wife to a small round of applause, and Albert kissed her gently, tenderly, in front of God and the assembled witnesses of Larkspur Flats, and Opal Quinn felt, for the first time in her 23 years, that she had finally found the place and the person where she truly belonged. The following spring, Albert and Opal filed a joint homestead claim on 160 acres, adjoining Opal's original leased grazing ground, land that included good water along the creek and enough range for both her sheep and the small herd of cattle Albert purchased with his remaining savings. It was, in its way, a radical thing, running cattle and sheep together on the same operation, something most ranchers in the territory considered impossible or foolish. But Albert had learned enough from watching Opal's careful management of her flock to understand that with proper fencing and rotation, the two could coexist far better than the old cattle and sheep feuds suggested. Reginald Cobb did not simply accept his defeat and move on, however. Through that first year of their marriage, he continued his campaign of small cruelties and legal harassment, contesting water rights, spreading rumors in town about the Kendricks' supposed mismanagement of the range, even once sending riders to intimidate their small operation under cover of night, though Albert and Bandit together proved more than capable of driving off any such attempts, with little more than shotgun blasts fired deliberately wide and Bandit's fierce, one-eyed determination. It was not until the autumn of 1880, nearly a full year into their marriage, that Cobb's schemes finally caught up with him in a manner that satisfied even Opal's sense of justice. His aggressive expansion, funded largely on credit against future cattle sales, had left him overextended precisely when a brutal early blizzard swept through the territory that November, killing cattle by the thousands across the open range, where Cobb had insisted on running his herds without adequate shelter or winter feed, believing, as many cattle barons of that era did, that cattle could simply fend for themselves through even the harshest winters. Opal and Albert's smaller, more carefully managed operation, by contrast, survived the blizzard largely intact, because Opal's years of shepherding had taught her the necessity of proper winter shelter and feed reserves, lessons Albert had absorbed and applied to their cattle as readily as their sheep. When the spring thaw came, Cobb's outfit had lost nearly 60% of its herd, a catastrophic blow from which the Bar Diamond never fully recovered, and within 2 years Cobb was forced to sell off much of his range to cover his debts, eventually leaving the territory altogether for opportunities in Montana, his ambitions humbled by the same harsh land he had once believed he could dominate through sheer force of will and wealth. Opal felt no particular satisfaction in Cobb's downfall, only a quiet sense that the land itself had rendered its own justice in a way no court or sheriff in the territory had been willing to provide. The years that followed were not without their hardships, the Wild West of the 1880s being no gentle place for any rancher, large or small. But Albert and Opal built their operation steadily, season by season, their combined flock and herd growing as their reputation for fair dealing and careful husbandry spread throughout the territory. They hired on hands as they could afford them, always paying fair wages regardless of whether a man had experience with cattle or sheep, and their ranch became known, somewhat unusually for the era, as a place where sheep and cattle men worked side by side without the bitter rivalry that plagued so much of the territory. Their first child, a son they named Etienne after the old Basque sheepherder who had given Opal her start, was born in the spring of 1881, a robust, dark-haired boy who by the age of 4 was already following his father around the corrals with fierce determination, demanding to help with chores far beyond his capability. Opal watched her husband teach their son patience and gentleness with the animals, the same qualities Albert had shown her from their very first meeting, and felt her heart swell with a happiness she had once believed impossible. Their second child, a daughter named Clara after Opal's own mother, arrived 2 years later in 1883, a quieter, more thoughtful child who from her earliest years showed a particular gift for working with the dogs, training the puppies that Bandit's eventual successor, a scruffy border collie named Scout, produced in litters over the years that followed. Bandit himself lived to a ripe old age for a working dog, finally passing peacefully in his sleep in the barn one winter evening in 1885, having spent his final years mostly resting by the fire while Scout took over the active herding duties. And Opal wept for the old dog as she had wept for few losses in her life, for he had been her sole companion through the hardest, loneliest stretch of her early years on the leased grazing land, and she never forgot the debt she owed him. By 1888, 9 years into their marriage, Albert and Opal Kendrick's ranch had grown to become one of the most respected operations in the territory, their combined flock and herd numbering well over 2,000 head between sheep and cattle. Their homestead expanded through additional land purchases into a proper ranch house that Albert had built with his own hands over several winters, room by room, as their family and their prosperity grew together. They had by then 4 children in total, Etienne and Clara joined by a second son, named Thomas after Albert's own father, born in 1885, and a third daughter, a lively, red-haired girl named Rose, born in 1887, who from her earliest days showed every sign of inheriting her mother's fierce independence and stubborn courage. It was on a warm evening in June of 1888 that Albert and Opal sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard below, while the sun set in brilliant colors over the Wind River foothills, the same foothills where Opal had once buried an old sheepherder alone, believing herself abandoned by the world, and Albert reached over and took her hand in his, weathered now by nearly a decade of hard ranch work, but still gentle in its touch. "Do you ever think back on those days," he asked quietly, "when Silas Whitmore threw you over, and you had nothing but a burnt wedding dress and a dying man's sheep?" "Every day," Opal said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched Etienne, now 7, teaching little Rose how to whistle for Scout across the yard. "I think about how certain I was that my life was over, that no decent man would ever want a woman with debts and a broken engagement behind her, that I'd be alone forever tending sheep nobody else wanted on land nobody else valued. And now I think Silas Whitmore did me the greatest kindness of my life, though he never intended it," Opal said, smiling up at her husband. "If he hadn't thrown me over, I never would have taken on Etienne's flock, never would have been standing at that fence line the day you came off your horse with a broken arm, never would have found the truest love of my life in a cattle hand willing to give up everything rather than stand by while injustice was done. I'd have found you regardless, Albert said, with the quiet certainty that had characterized him from their very first meeting. Some things, I believe, are simply meant to be, Opal. I believe I was always meant to break my arm on that particular stretch of trail, on that particular spring morning, so that I might find my way to you. That's a very romantic notion for a practical cattle man, Opal teased, though her eyes were bright with tears of happiness. I learned romance from watching you tend sheep with more patience and love than most folks show their own children, Albert said, kissing her temple gently. You taught me that the truest strength isn't in dominating a thing through fear, the way Cobb tried to dominate this whole territory, but in leading with love, the way old Etienne told you sheep must be led. I've tried to build our whole life on that lesson, Opal, every single day since I first watched you set my arm with such gentle, sure hands. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun finished its descent, their children's laughter carrying across the yard, their flocks and herds settling for the evening in the pastures beyond, the ranch house behind them warm with lamplight, and the smell of the supper Opal had left simmering on the stove. And Opal Quinn Kendrick, who had once stood in a burning parlor believing herself utterly without worth or prospects, understood at last that she had built, from the ashes of that rejection, a life richer and more deeply loved than she could ever have imagined possible. In the years that followed, the old prejudice between cattle and sheep interests in the territory gradually softened, in no small part due to the example set by the Kendrick ranch's continued success and fair dealing. And by the time their eldest son Etienne came of age and began courting a young woman from a neighboring sheep-ranching family, the bitter feuds of the previous generation had faded into little more than old men's stories told over winter fires, cautionary tales of a harsher, less generous time that the territory, and the Kendrick family in particular, had worked hard to leave behind. Opal never forgot the debt she owed to old Etienne Laraga, and every spring, on the anniversary of his passing, she and Albert would ride together up to the small rise where she had buried him alone all those years ago, now marked with a proper headstone Albert had commissioned once their finances allowed, and they would leave fresh flowers and speak quietly of the gift he had given her, 300 sheep nobody else wanted, and through them, a chance at a life she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. "Thank you," Opal would whisper each year, standing at that quiet grave with her husband's arm around her shoulders, and their children in later years gathered respectfully nearby. "Thank you for trusting a stranger with everything you had left in this world. I hope I've honored that trust." And every year, standing there in the gentle spring wind with the mountains rising blue and distant behind them, Opal Quinn Kendrick knew, with complete and unshakable certainty, that she had. Their ranch prospered for decades to come, weathering the harsh winters and economic uncertainties that tested so many operations across the territory, sustained always by the partnership Albert and Opal had built between them, a partnership founded not on the cold arithmetic that had governed Silas Whitmore's brief courtship, but on genuine respect, shared labor, and a love that had grown deeper and more resilient with each passing season. Much like the flocks and herds they tended together, with equal measures of patience and devotion. Silas Whitmore himself, Opal heard many years later through the loose talk that traveled between territories, had eventually married a wealthy rancher's daughter from Colorado, a union built on exactly the kind of arithmetic he had once prized above all else. But the marriage was reportedly a cold and joyless one, and Opal found she felt not satisfaction in this news, nor even lingering resentment, but only a distant sort of pity for a man who had never learned, as she had, that true wealth lay not in land or cattle or careful calculation, but in the willingness to love fully and without reservation, come what injustice or hardship might. As for Reginald Cobb, He was never heard from again in Larkspur Flats after his departure for Montana, though rumor had it his fortunes never fully recovered from that catastrophic blizzard of 1880. A fitting end, Opal often thought, for a man who had believed he could bend both land and law to his will through wealth and intimidation alone, only to discover that the wild territory he sought to dominate cared nothing at all for a man's ambitions when measured against the raw power of nature and the quiet, steady justice of honest hearts working together. By 1895, 17 years after that first burning wedding dress had signaled the end of one life and the unknowing beginning of another, Albert and Opal Kendrick stood together at their eldest son Etienne's own wedding, watching him marry his sheep-ranching sweetheart in the very same Larkspur Flats church where they themselves had exchanged vows so many years before. And Opal caught her husband's eye across the small, gathered crowd and saw reflected there the same deep, abiding love and gratitude that had carried them through every hardship the territory had thrown their way. "We did well, didn't we?" Albert murmured to her later that evening, as they watched their son and his new bride dance beneath lantern lights strung across the ranch yard. Their other children, Clara now 18 and courting a young schoolteacher from town, Thomas at 14 already showing his father's steady hand with horses, and Rose at 10 still fierce and independent as ever, all gathered around them in the warm summer evening. "We did," Opal agreed, leaning into her husband's embrace as she had done countless times over the 17 years of their marriage. "Better than I ever dared hope for. That day Silas Whitmore decided I wasn't worth the arithmetic." "His loss," Albert said simply, as he always did when the old wound was mentioned, "was the greatest gain of my entire life." "And mine," Opal whispered, and kissed her husband gently beneath the lantern light, surrounded by the family and the life they had built together from nothing but 300 sheep nobody else wanted, a dying man's trust, and a love that had grown, season by season, year by year, into something no cattle baron's cold calculations could ever have hoped to purchase. The sheep still grazed the hillsides of the Kendrick ranch long after that summer evening, their gentle bleating a constant, comforting presence across land that had once been the site of such bitter feuding, and the cattle grazed alongside them in the peaceable arrangement Albert and Opal had pioneered together, and the ranch house stood warm and welcoming through winters and summers alike, home to a family built on love rather than arithmetic, on partnership rather than ownership, on the simple, radical belief that a person's worth was never measured by their debts or their circumstances, but by the courage and compassion with which they met the world. And Opal Quinn Kendrick, who had once stood alone in a Wyoming pasture believing herself utterly without prospects, lived out the remainder of her long and richly loved life exactly where she had always belonged, among the sheep nobody else wanted, beside the man who had wanted her more than anything else in the world. In a love story the wild territory itself seemed to have conspired, through hardship and injustice and the strange, unpredictable mercy of fate, to bring into being